Nobody wants to hear this. You especially do not want to hear this because you have been trying everything else first and everything else has not worked. And this is the thing that keeps surfacing as the answer. And you keep finding reasons why it does not apply to your specific situation, why your situation is more complicated, why walking away would be misunderstood, why the timing is not right, why there is one more thing to try before it comes to this. There is not one more thing. You have tried the one more thing 17 times, and every time the result has been the same, not because you did it wrong, not because you are not enough, but because the thing you keep trying is the thing that the avoidance system was specifically built to absorb without changing. You have been pushing against a wall that does not respond to pushing, and the only move that wall was ever designed to respond to is the one you have been most afraid to make, walking away. Not as a tactic, not as a manipulation, not as the thing you do while secretly waiting for them to chase, the real version. The version that respects you enough to be honest about what this has cost. The version that the avoidance system cannot wait out or deflect or absorb into the existing structure. Here is why it works, and here is exactly how to do it. Why avoidance cannot respect you while you stay. Respect is not something the avoidance system withholds deliberately. It is not a decision they are making about your worth. It is a structural outcome of the dynamic as it has been operating. And to understand why it is structural rather than personal, you have to understand what the dynamic has been communicating to them about you. Not what you intended to communicate, what has actually been received. Every time you stayed after the walls went up, something was communicated. Every time you absorbed the distance and waited it out and were there on the other side of the retreat, something was communicated. Every time you explained your needs and got deflected and explained them again and adjusted your approach and tried the softer version and the clearer version and the most patient version, something was communicated. What was communicated was this: the relationship has no flaw. There is no level of unavailability that produces a real consequence. Your presence is not contingent on the dynamic meeting any particular standard. The access they have to you, to your warmth, your investment, your continued emotional availability, is not something that can be lost through the pattern continuing. That communication, delivered not in words, but in the consistent behavioral reality of you remaining, is what makes respect structurally impossible. Not because you are not respectable, because respect requires stakes, and stakes require the genuine possibility of loss. And the genuine possibility of loss requires that your presence be something that can actually be forfeited through how the relationship operates. While you stay, regardless of how much pain you are in, regardless of how clearly you have expressed that the dynamic is not working, regardless of how many conversations have been had about what needs to change, your presence has not been forfeitable. It has been unconditional in the specific, structural way that produces not gratitude, but the quiet, unexamined assumption that it will always be there. The avoidant does not consciously think, they will stay no matter what, so I do not have to try. It operates below that level, as a basic feature of how the nervous system has mapped the relationship, as a background fact about the landscape. You are there. You have always been there. The landscape includes you as a permanent feature. Permanent features do not get respected. The way things that can be lost get respected. That is not a character flaw in the avoidant. It is a feature of how the human attachment system processes permanence versus contingency. The permanent gets taken for granted. The contingent gets valued. Walking away makes you contingent for the first time in a real and undeniable way. And contingency is where respect lives. The version that does not work and why you have already tried it. Before the real version, let's name the fake one. Because most people who arrive at this conversation have already attempted the walk away multiple times in the version that did not work. And understanding exactly why it did not work is the difference between trying again with the same result and doing it differently enough this time that something actually changes. The fake walk away has a specific quality. It is aimed. It is organized around producing a response. Underneath the leaving is a sustained active attention to whether the leaving is producing the intended effect. The phone gets checked. The reaction gets monitored. The departure is real enough to be felt, but not real enough to be irreversible. There is a line, invisible but present, at which the leaving stops and the return becomes available. Usually that line is wherever the avoidance response, or lack of response, becomes more than the hope can bear. The avoidance system detects this, not consciously, but the system that has been mapping the relationship landscape also maps the quality of the departure. And a departure that is monitoring its own effect, that has a specific outcome it is waiting for, reads differently than a departure that is genuinely organized around forward motion. It reads as a longer version of the same reaching. The reaching went quiet and moved toward the door, but it is still reaching, still waiting, still contingent on a specific response rather than on the actual, interior, forward-moving reality of someone who is genuinely leaving. And the avoidance system waits it out, because the system, which has successfully waited out every previous version of the departure, correctly assesses this one as the same type it has always encountered, a departure with a return built into it, a walk away that has not actually walked away. The system is not wrong, and its patience is not indifference. It is the accurate reading of what is actually happening underneath the performance of departure, which is why the return always happens, why you went back, why the walk away that was supposed to change things ended up being another loop in the same dynamic. Not because walking away does not work, because the version you tried was not the real one. What the real walk away requires before you take a single step. The real walk away does not start with a conversation or a message or a decision about contact. It starts somewhere interior, in a place that is entirely invisible from the outside and entirely determinative of whether what happens next is real or another version of the same performance. It starts with grief, specifically the grief that has not yet been allowed to complete, the mourning of what this was and what it was not going to be that has been deferred by the persistent hope that the situation is still resolvable. That has been interrupted every time the avoidant reached and the warmth returned and the hope reactivated before the mourning could finish its work. The grief needs to complete before the walk away is real, because an incomplete grief is a hope that has not yet been surrendered, and a hope that has not yet been surrendered is a return waiting to happen. The departure goes as far as the grief is gone, no further, and when the grief is only partial, the departure is only partial. And a partial departure is what the avoidance system has been successfully waiting out. Letting the grief complete means something specific and uncomfortable. It means allowing yourself to know, not intellectually, in the body, in the place where hope lives, that the choosing is not coming, not eventually, not with enough patience, not with the right combination of behaviors, that what has been available in this dynamic is what is available. That the ceiling is real, that the reset is not a temporary state but a structural feature, that the almost is the point, not a stage on the way to something more, but the thing itself. That knowing, when it arrives as felt truth rather than understood concept, produces a grief that is specific and heavy and not made lighter by understanding why it is happening. It produces the mourning of the relationship as it was almost going to be, of the version of them that existed in the best moments, of the future that was built around the hope of the choosing finally coming. That grief, allowed to be what it is, without being interrupted by hope or action, or the performance of moving on before the moving on is real. That is what the real walk away is built on, not the decision, not the message, not the contact reduction, the completed grief underneath all of it. When the grief has done enough of its work, when the knowledge has moved from the head into the body, into the place where actual behavior is generated, the walkaway becomes not a decision you have to make, but a natural expression of where you actually are. You are not performing leaving. You have left, internally, and the external follows the internal in the way that genuine behavioral change always follows genuine internal shift. Exactly how to do it, the specific, practical reality. no speech. This is the first and most important thing. The walkaway that comes with a speech is still the argument, still the reaching, still the attempt to be heard through the act of departing that has characterized every previous attempt to communicate what was not landing. The speech also gives the avoidance system something to respond to, something to manage. The deflection playbook has extensive material for responding to departure speeches. The calm detachment, the reframing, the subtle turning of the speech into evidence of the exact instability that justified the distance. The speech becomes an interaction, and the interaction gets managed, and the managed ones produces the same outcome the unmanaged ones produced. No speech. The real walk away is quiet. It is the reduction of contact that happens without announcement, the unavailability that develops without explanation, the forward motion that begins without a declaration of forward motion. This does not mean disappearing without basic human decency. If there is a relationship that requires some acknowledgement of its ending, a genuine relationship rather than an ambiguous situationship, a brief, simple, non-flooded statement is sufficient, something that says this is not working for me and I am moving forward. Not the history, not the explanation of the psychology, not the final attempt to make them understand what they did. Just where you are, simply stated, without the machinery of everything that led to it. And then the behavior that follows the statement is the walkaway, not the statement itself. The behavior is contact reduction that is genuine rather than strategic. The phone not checked for their response. The message not sent when the impulse fires. The reaching not acted on when the withdrawal produces the familiar anxiety. The day continued. The life moved through. The forward motion pursued not as evidence of departure, but as the actual living of the life that the departure made room for. The behavior is the same three things: leaving, genuine indifference that develops over time, the full, visible, unapologetic choosing of yourself, applied consistently, not perfectly, but actually. When the second guessing arrives, it will arrive, with specific, targeted arguments that are perfectly calibrated to your psychology because they are generated by your psychology. The what-ifs, the but the connection was real, the maybe this time, the was I too hasty, the did I give it enough time, the what if they change. These are not insights. They are the hope that the grief did not fully complete presenting itself as rational reconsideration. And the way to tell the difference between genuine reconsideration and grief reasserting itself is simple. Genuine reconsideration is based on new evidence, on something that is actually changed in the dynamic, on observable, behavioral, sustained evidence of architectural shift in the avoidance system. The second guessing is based on the same evidence that was always there. The connection was real. The feeling was genuine. The best moments were worth something. All of that is true. None of it is new, and none of it changes the structural reality of what was and was not available in the dynamic. When the second guessing arrives, and it will, in the quiet moments, in the tender moments, in the moments when something good happens, and the first impulse is to share it with them, the practice is not to argue with it, not to marshal the evidence against it, just to notice it, to name it internally. There is the hope again, and then to continue, not because the hope is wrong to exist, but because acting on it before the evidence of genuine change is present is what produced the previous returns that produced the previous results. The second guessing is survivable. Every single time it has arrived before, it is eventually passed. Not immediately, not without cost, but it passes. And each time you move through it without acting on it, each time the impulse to reach back fires and you continue forward anyway. The next instance arrives with slightly less force. The conditioning weakens. The new pattern strengthens. The walkaway becomes more real with each day that it is actually walked. What respect looks like when it arrives. Not what you imagined. The dramatic, finally choosing you, walls coming down version is the cinematic one. The real version is quieter, more tentative, carrying the specific quality of someone who has encountered something they were not prepared for and are processing it on a timeline that is entirely theirs. It looks like the small reach that is different from the previous small reaches. Not in its surface content, the reach itself may look similar, different in its quality, in the specific, felt sense of something that is not the system managing the hook, but the system genuinely encountering the loss and responding to the loss from a place of actual reckoning rather than automatic activation. It looks like accountability that was not previously available, the ability to say something true about what happened without the immediate deflection into the delivery or the timing or the complexity of the situation. Just something true, simply, without the management. It looks like consistency that does not require pressure to maintain. The follow-through that previous versions of reaching never produced. The presence that sustains itself across the ordinary moments rather than appearing in the moments of threatened loss and receding once the threat has passed. And it looks like you, the version of you that walked away and did the grief and built the genuine forward motion, receiving it from the grounded place, not collapsing into the relief of it, not flooding with everything that was held during the departure, meeting it at its actual temperature, warm and clear, and genuinely okay with whatever it is and whatever it becomes. That meeting between the avoidant who is reaching from a place of actual reckoning and the you who is receiving from a place of genuine okayness is the first real moment in the entire dynamic. The first moment that is not organized around the structure of the in-between or the hook or the defended life maintaining itself at the cost of genuine connection. It is the first moment that is just real, two people, present, with what is true, and it is only available because you walked away, really walked, not performed it, not strategized it, not aimed at producing this moment, just left, into your own life, for real. Everything the respect required was contained in that leaving, not in the explanation of it, not in the speech, not in the hope that it would produce this, in the actual, interior, grief-completed, life-inhabited leaving itself. That is the how. Exactly. In full. And you are more ready for it than you think. The leaving is done. Or it is in process. Or it is the thing you are building toward. The grief still completing. The internal shift still developing. The forward motion still finding its direction. Wherever you are in the arc, something has changed. The understanding is different. The relationship with yourself is different. The way you are reading the dynamic, with the specific, embodied, no longer deniable clarity of someone who has seen the mechanism fully, is different. And different is not comfortable. Different is not the relief you were hoping clarity would bring. Different is the specific, unglamorous, daily challenge of being in a new place without yet having the fluency that makes the new place feel like home. That challenge deserves to be addressed directly, because the gap between understanding what needs to happen and actually living inside it with any kind of sustainable ease, that gap is where people get lost, where the insights fade back into the noise of the daily reality, where the old patterns reassert themselves not through dramatic failure, but through the quiet accumulation of small moments where the grounded response was available and the old response happened instead. That gap is not a sign that the work is not real. It is the work, the actual, living, daily, imperfect work of becoming someone different in a situation that keeps presenting the stimuli of the old pattern. So let's go into the gap, into what it actually feels like to be doing this in real time, into the specific practical moment-by-moment reality of walking away from someone with avoidant attachment, when every part of your nervous system has been trained by the dynamic to do the opposite. The days that test everything, there are specific days that are harder than others, not the days you expect, not the significant dates or the obvious triggers, the random Tuesday, the ordinary afternoon, the moment with no context or cause where the absence lands with unexpected weight and the practiced groundedness feels suddenly thin and unconvincing. Those days are not regression. They are the nonlinear reality of genuine change. The nervous system does not heal in a straight line. It heals in the jagged, unpredictable, 2 steps forward, 1 step back pattern that all deep conditioning takes when it is being genuinely replaced rather than just suppressed. On those days, the most important thing is not to perform okayness, not to push through the feeling with the forced momentum of someone who has decided to be fine. The performed okayness is the old pattern wearing new clothes. It is the suppression that produced the flood, that produced the argument, that produced the distance, just operating in a different direction now. Instead of suppressing the need for them, suppressing the grief of leaving them. The grief on those days is allowed to be what it is, felt fully, without being acted on, without being converted into contact, without being used as evidence that the walkaway was a mistake, or that the connection was too significant to leave, or that the grief itself means something about whether the leaving was right. The grief means you loved something real. That is all it means. It does not mean the leaving was wrong. It does not mean the return is warranted. It does not mean the investment of more time in the structure that produced the grief would produce a different outcome. It means you are human, and humans grieve real things. And the grief is the proof that the connection mattered, not a reason to go back to it, but a testament to the reality of what was there, which deserves to be honored by the full feeling of its loss, rather than bypassed in the name of the forward motion that will follow it. Feel it on the random Tuesday, in the ordinary afternoon. Let it be what it is, and then, not immediately, not before it has been genuinely felt, continue, not because the continuing is easy, because the continuing is the practice, and the practice is what the new pattern is made of. The moment they reach back, it will happen, not always when you expect it, not always in the form you anticipate it, but the genuine walk away, the one built on completed grief and actual forward motion, produces the activation in the avoidance system that everything else failed to produce. And that activation eventually expresses itself outward in the small, tentative, plausibly deniable way that avoidant reaching always announces itself. And when it happens, you will feel everything at once, the relief and the wariness, the hope and the knowledge, the pull toward the familiar and the groundedness that the walkaway built, all of it simultaneously, in the specific, complicated, nothing is clean way that real emotional experience operates. Here is what matters most in that moment, not what you say, how you are when you say it. The how is everything, because the avoidance system, which has been processing the change in your behavior, which has been accumulating the data points of your genuine forward motion, which has been updating its prediction about what closeness with you costs, that system is reading your response not primarily for content, but for quality, for the specific emotional texture of how you receive the reach. Does the reach produce the relief flooding that confirms the hook is still intact? Does it produce the collapse back into full availability that tells the system the departure was temporary and the warmth is restored? Does it produce the anxious, monitoring quality of someone who has been waiting and is now managing the response carefully to maximize the probability of the positive outcome? Or does it produce something else? The genuine, unhurried, fully inhabiting their own life quality of someone who is receiving the reach from a place of actual okayness, who is warm but not flooded, present but not reorganized, open to what this might be without being consumed by the hope of what it might be. That quality, the second one, is the respect that the walkaway earned, expressed back toward the avoidant in the form of a response they have not received before. And it communicates, without saying it, the thing that all the previous words and explanations and patient expressions of need never managed to communicate. You are okay, actually, not performing it. Your life is real and moving and full enough to be genuinely in. The reaching is welcome, but not necessary. The warmth of their presence adds to something that is already sufficient, rather than completing something that has been incomplete without them. That communication, felt rather than stated, behavioral rather than verbal, is what the avoidance system encounters when the reach is met with genuine groundedness, and it is the most disarming thing their defense system has ever encountered, because it was built to manage attempts, pressure. The specific emotional demand of someone whose okayness is contingent on their response, It has no protocol for someone who is genuinely, non-negotiably okay. What respect actually feels like in the body, not the concept of respect, the felt experience of it arriving after its absence, because the absence was so long and so thorough that when the respect begins to be present in the dynamic, you may not immediately recognize it as what it is. It may arrive without the clarity of announcement, without feeling definitively different from what preceded it. It feels like being taken seriously. The specific, subtle, felt sense of someone who is engaging with you, as someone whose reactions matter and whose responses have weight, who is not running the deflection playbook, because the deflection playbook assumes you will stay regardless, who is not managing the warmth to the minimum level required to maintain the connection, because the minimum is no longer sufficient when the connection is actually at stake. It feels like the absence of the management, the specific relief of being in an interaction that is not being carefully calibrated to produce a particular outcome in you, where the warmth is not deployed to reactivate the investment, but simply expressed because it is felt, where the engagement is not structured to maintain access, but genuinely offered because the person in front of them has become someone whose presence they cannot take for granted. It feels like being met at your actual level, not the accommodated level, not the level that the dynamic structure required you to shrink to in order to remain in it. Your actual level. The level of the person who walked away and grieved and built the forward motion and arrived at genuine okayness. The level that was always yours, but that the old dynamic could not reach because you were not standing at it consistently. That feeling of being met at your actual level by someone whose system is genuinely responding to the real you rather than managing the available you is what respect feels like when it arrives after its absence. And it is worth waiting for, worth the grief, worth the walk away, worth the random Tuesdays and the ordinary afternoons and the non-linear, jagged, imperfect process of becoming the version of yourself that the respect requires. The part where it becomes about you completely. Here is where the reframe lands, the one that the title pointed toward and the script has been earning. The respect that the walkaway produces in the avoidant, real, genuine, earned through the behavioral reality of your departure rather than through accommodation, matters. It is not nothing. It changes the dynamic in ways that were not previously possible. It creates the conditions for something real to develop, if something real is what both people are capable of and willing to build. But the respect that matters most is not theirs. It is yours. The walkaway is the most respectful thing you have ever done for yourself. The leaving, the real version, built on completed grief and genuine forward motion, is the first time you have treated your own needs as non-negotiable, your own presence as contingent on being met, rather than as unconditionally available, your own time and emotional investment as something with standards attached, rather than something freely given, regardless of what is offered in return. That self-respect, the kind that exists in the behavior rather than in the belief, that is demonstrated through the walkaway rather than stated in the conversation, is the permanent outcome. The thing that stays regardless of what the avoidant does with it, regardless of whether the respect they develop translates into the choosing, regardless of whether the architecture shifts enough to produce the relationship that the connection always had the potential to be. You walked away from something real that was not enough, from a connection that mattered and a dynamic that was costing you, from the hope that had been deferring your life pending its resolution. You walked away with the grief completed and the forward motion real and the choosing of yourself actual and unapologetic. That is not a tactic that produced an outcome. That is a person who knows their worth demonstrating it in the most fundamental way available, through behavior, through the consistent, daily, imperfect but actual reality of a life that treats itself as worth fully inhabiting. The avoidance respect follows that, eventually, in its tentative, small, plausibly deniable way, because respect follows what is genuinely respectable, and what is genuinely respectable is not the accommodation or the patience or the endless availability. It is the leaving, the grief, the forward motion, the okayness that is not performed. But that respect, theirs, is a side effect, not the point. The point is yours. The self-respect that the walkaway built, the relationship with yourself that the grief produced, the life that the forward motion created, the version of you that stands on the other side of all of it, grounded, clear, genuinely inhabiting your own existence. That is the point. Everything else is what follows from that. The avoidance movement, the dynamic's potential transformation, the possibility of something real being built if both people arrive at the threshold with genuine capacity and willingness. All of that follows from you, from the walk away that was real, from the self-respect that the walk away expressed and built simultaneously. The last thing, you came into this conversation at one of three places. Maybe you had not walked away yet and needed to understand why it was necessary. Maybe you were in the process and the second guessing was loud, and you needed the clarity to continue. Maybe you had walked away and gone back and were here because the return confirmed what you already knew, and you needed to find the real version this time. Wherever you are somewhere different now. Not at the destination. The destination is not a place you arrive at and remain in permanently. It is a practice. A daily, imperfect, sometimes tender, always worth it practice of treating yourself as the primary relationship in your life. That practice is the walk away, not the moment of departure, but the daily continuation of it. The life that keeps moving forward not because the departure produced the desired response, but because the life is worth moving forward into regardless. The avoidant cannot respect you until you walk away. That is true, and the deeper truth underneath it, the one the whole script has been building toward, is this. You cannot fully respect yourself until you walk away either. Not because you are not respectable before the walk away, but because the walk away is the behavioral expression of the self-respect. It is what the self-respect looks like when it stops being a belief and becomes a life. When it stops being something you feel in the good moments and becomes something you demonstrate in the hardest ones. The walk away is the self-respect made real. And you, finally, after everything it took to get here, are ready to make it real. Not for them, for you. That has always been the only reason that mattered. Go. Something nobody tells you about the walk away after you have actually done it. The silence is louder than you expected, not the silence from them. You prepared for that. You knew the absence of contact was coming, and you built the framework for surviving it, and you did the grief work, and you have the forward motion, and intellectually you were ready for the quiet that follows genuine departure. The silence that is louder than expected is the one inside you, the one that opens up when the dynamic, which was consuming an enormous amount of interior space whether it was going well or badly, is no longer running. When the monitoring stops because there is nothing left to monitor. When the calibrating stops because there is no longer anyone to calibrate for. When the hoping stops because the grief completed and the hoping was what the grief was releasing. That interior silence is disorienting in a way that nobody adequately prepares you for, because it was supposed to feel like relief, like the exhale after holding your breath too long, like the specific peace of someone who has finally set down something heavy. And sometimes it does feel like that, in moments, in the cleaner hours, but it also feels like a room that has been suddenly emptied of its furniture, functional, quiet, and somehow more spacious than comfortable, more open than you know what to do with yet. That openness is not emptiness, though it feels like emptiness at first. It is the space that the dynamic was occupying, returned to you, available for something different. Not immediately filled with meaning or direction or the satisfying forward motion that the framework promised. Just open, waiting for you to figure out what belongs in it. Figuring that out is the next part of this. And it is quieter and slower and less dramatic than everything that came before it. But it is also, in the specific way that ordinary things can be, the most important part. What the space actually is. Let's be precise about what was returned to you when the dynamic stopped consuming it, because precision matters here. Vague descriptions of reclaimed bandwidth do not adequately convey what is actually available now in a way that helps you use it. What was returned is attention, specifically the attention that was permanently allocated to the management of uncertainty, the constant low-level processing of what their last message meant, what the silence since then indicated, whether the warmth in the previous interaction was the beginning of something or just the irregular reward cycling back, whether you were reading things correctly or projecting, whether the distance was about you or about them or about the structural feature of the dynamic that you now understand completely and understood intellectually for a long time before the understanding produced. Behavior. All of that processing, continuous, exhausting, running underneath everything else like a program that never closed, consumed attention that was not available for anything else while it was running. And it was always running, even in the moments when you were doing other things, even when you were present in your life in ways that looked complete from the outside. Underneath the apparent presence was the program, always processing, always allocating a portion of your cognitive and emotional resources to the management of the uncertainty. That program has closed, and the attention it was consuming is available, not as a dramatic flood of newfound capacity, as a gradual, quiet re-emergence of the ability to be fully present in whatever you are actually doing, to give your complete attention to the thing in front of you without the background processing pulling a percentage of it elsewhere, to have a thought that has nothing to do with the dynamic and have it remain uninterrupted by the dynamic for its entire duration. That sounds small. It is not small. It is the difference between living your life and watching yourself live your life from a slight remove, while the real processing happens elsewhere. And most people who have been in an extended consuming dynamic do not fully realize how significant the remove was until it is no longer there. The space that opened is the return of your full presence to your own life. And what you do with that presence, how you inhabit the openness rather than immediately filling it with the next consuming thing, is the question that this part of the conversation is about. The temptation to fill it immediately, it will be strong. The impulse to fill the space, to replace the consuming dynamic with something else that provides a similar level of activation. Another person, another situation, the next chapter of the same story, with different characters. The nervous system that has been running on the specific fuel of the irregular reward does not immediately welcome the quiet. It interprets the quiet as something to be resolved rather than something to be inhabited. It looks for the next source of the familiar activation because familiar activation, however costly, feels more like aliveness than the unfamiliar quiet of genuine forward motion. This is the part of the process where people make the substitution error, where the walk away from one consuming dynamic leads directly into another, one before the interior space has had time to do what it needs to do, before the nervous system has had the opportunity to recalibrate to what genuine availability feels like, before the self that was organized around the dynamic has had the chance to figure out what it is organized around when the dynamic is not there. The substitution feels like moving on. It looks like moving on. From the outside, it is indistinguishable from healthy forward motion into new connection. But from the inside, if the honesty is available to feel it, there is a specific quality to it that is different from genuine readiness. A quality of the reaching toward the next thing before the completion of the process that the walkaway began. A quality of filling before the space has been allowed to show you what it is. The space needs to be allowed to show you what it is. This requires a tolerance for the unfamiliar quiet that the dynamic trains you not to have, a willingness to sit in the openness without immediately solving it, a trust that the direction will emerge from the space if you give it time rather than needing to be imported into the space from outside. That trust is not passive. It is the active daily, sometimes uncomfortable practice of choosing the space over the substitute, of noticing the impulse to fill and letting it pass without acting on it, of inhabiting the quiet long enough for the genuine signals of your own life to become audible through it. Those signals are there. They have been there throughout. Underneath the noise of the dynamic, they have been generating quietly, consistently, pointing toward the things that are genuinely yours. the wants that predate the dynamic, the directions that have nothing to do with anyone else's unavailability, the version of your life that was always available and always yours, and has been waiting with remarkable patience for the attention that was always supposed to be primarily its. What the avoidant is doing in the silence, because it is still in your awareness, even in the walk away, even in the genuine forward motion. At some frequency, less than before but present, the question surfaces. What are they doing? Are they in the reckoning? Is the activation happening? Is the absence producing the movement that the walk away was supposed to produce? Here is what is true about that question. You are allowed to have it. The curiosity is not a sign that the walk away was not real or that the forward motion is performed. It is the residue of a significant attachment. Significant attachments leave residue. The residue diminishes over time, but it does not disappear immediately, and the presence of it is not evidence of failure. What matters is not whether the question surfaces. What matters is what you do when it surfaces. Whether it pulls you back into the monitoring and the checking and the management of the hope, or whether it surfaces, is acknowledged, and continues past the way clouds move through the sky without stopping there. What is actually true about what they are doing is this. They are somewhere on the arc, the genuine walk away, the real version, built on completed grief and actual forward motion, produces activation in the avoidance system that cannot be managed in the usual ways. The usual ways require your continued availability as the surface to manage against. Without that surface, the management has nowhere to go. The feeling has no available outlet through the familiar pattern of your accommodation absorbing it. So it stays internal, and it builds, in the specific way that suppressed feeling builds when the outlet it was relying on is no longer available, and what it builds toward is the reckoning, the internal confrontation with what the defended life costs, the slow, reluctant, happening below the surface reassessment of whether the escape hatch is worth what keeping it is costing. That process has its own timeline. It does not correspond to yours. It does not accelerate because you need it to. It does not produce visible results on the schedule that your hope prefers. It moves at the speed of the avoidant's own internal capacity for the specific discomfort of genuine self-confrontation. What you can control is whether the space you are inhabiting remains genuinely yours, forward-moving, self-directed, not organized around the hope of their reckoning arriving on a particular timeline, or whether it collapses back into the waiting room of the in-between with better furniture. The space remains yours by continuing to inhabit it, by the daily choices that fill it with the actual content of your actual life, rather than with the management of the hope, by the practice of treating your own forward motion as the primary story, rather than the supporting narrative to their journey toward readiness. Your life is the primary story. It has always been the primary story. The walk away was the moment you started writing it that way. The respect that builds in you, because there is a respect that has nothing to do with them and everything to do with the daily experience of being someone who did the hard thing and is continuing to do it. Every day that the walk away remains real, every day that the forward motion continues and the substitution error is avoided and the space is inhabited rather than immediately filled, something accumulates. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but in the specific, quiet, incremental way that self-respect builds when it is demonstrated through behavior rather than claimed through belief. You said you were going to walk away. You did. You said the grief needed to complete. You let it. You said the forward motion needed to be real. You made it real. And every day that those things remain true, every day that the behavior continues to match the understanding, the internal credibility builds. The self-trust deepens. The relationship with yourself that the walk-away began becomes more real and more stable and more genuinely yours. That is the respect that matters most, not what the avoidant develops in response to your departure. The respect you develop for yourself through the daily, imperfect, continuing practice of treating your own life as worth fully inhabiting. It does not require their response to be real. It does not require the reckoning to arrive, or the walls to come down, or the choosing to finally happen. It is built entirely within the territory of your own life, through your own behavior, in the quiet, ordinary, Tuesday afternoon reality of someone who said they were going to do the hard thing and keeps doing it. That respect, yours, for yourself, built daily through behavior, is the destination the title was always pointing toward. Not the respect that makes them treat you differently, the respect that makes you move differently through the world, through relationships, through the specific daily, moment by moment experience of being someone who knows their worth not as a concept, but as a lived behavioral, this is how I actually move reality. That is what the walkaway built. That is what the silence was making room for. That is what all of the grief and the practice and the forward motion and the random Tuesdays and the ordinary afternoons were accumulating toward. Not them choosing you, you choosing yourself. Finally, completely, in the most real and irreversible way, every single day. That is the how. That is the exactly. That is the whole thing. And you are already doing it.